is courage in the midst. And I don't know about you, but we certainly are living in an incredibly uncertain time, aren't we? And I've learned a couple of things about uncertainty that I wanted to share with you today and what we can do to work with it. Many of us had the direct experience of a deep uncertainty when the Twin Towers were attacked in 9/11 and the plane crashed into the Pentagon and into that field in Pennsylvania. And in a moment, all of our lives were changed forever. And if you lived during that time, you probably can remember how devastating and how ripped open our society felt. And you can remember the uncertainty of what was going to happen next and what were we going to do and how were we going to do it. And that time taught me a lot about working with uncertainty. One of the things that I noticed during that time is that people tend to go to their base nature in times of uncertainty. So if your base nature is angry, then you get angry when times are uncertain. And anger shows up in lots of ways: irritation, annoyance, rage. It's a spectrum. If your base nature is fear, and uncertainty really hits unexpectedly, you're going to perhaps experience a queasy feeling in your stomach, or anxiety that seems to ramp up, or a sense of very fearful set of actions that you do repetitively to in that time of uncertainty. And if you're someone that doesn't want to feel anything at all, you may lock down and get very willful and use your energy of pride to hold yourself stable and in place, even though the ground underneath is shaking. These core kind of root responses are very, very common. They're very typical. And I've certainly, I was telling my class earlier today, I've certainly been working with one of my core basic responses to uncertainty, which is to feel a lot of annoyance. I'm annoyed, and in a general sense. And it's just so silly, because having trained myself to recognize when the base things show up, I will feel the annoyance rise and then I'll laugh at myself. Because, of course, none of these maneuvers that we developed over time when we were younger to work with instability and uncertainty actually really do what we're hoping that they'll do. In fact, you may have noticed, if your root response to uncertainty is fear, and you allow that to take over, you don't feel safer. You feel more and more and more fearful. If your root response is anger, you don't feel less anger as the uncertainty goes on. You feel more and more. And your perception begins to latch on to different things that you can be annoyed or irritated or just downright angry about. And if you've been using your will to stabilize yourself during this earthquake of uncertainty, what begins to happen is you develop what the Buddhists call an iron heart. And that means that you've walled yourself off more and more and more to your own feelings. And you know what happens when we do that over time is we actually become ill, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. So knowing what your base is will help you to recognize it when it wants to kind of take you on its little journey of ineffective coping. And instead, what we need to begin to learn how to do is cope in more powerful, more in the present moment ways that you and I both know, but sometimes that base programming will take over. So I want to remind you of things that you already know. And to do that, I wanted to talk about courage. You know, the root word of courage is coeur, which in French means heart. And so courage is responding from the heart, which I know for some of you is like, oh, we're not going to go into some mamby-pamby, touchy-feely thing, are we? No, we're not, actually. But what we are going to look at is the incredible capacity of our mind and heart unified together to help us navigate times like this in ways that not only support us, but also then can be of support to other people. So how do we do that, and what am I talking about? Well, let me turn to one of my base teachers. When I was young on the spiritual path, Pema Chodron's teacher was actually one of my teachers through his teachings in his books. And one of his books is called The Sacred Path of the Spiritual Warrior. And it was a pivotal moment in my spiritual path to read that book and begin to contemplate living from a different place than those base negative programs that I had learned so well. What Trungpa Rinpoche was suggesting, and Pema Chodron has now taken his teachings and made them global, is he was suggesting that there is actually a way to be with shakiness, to be with uncertainty, that allows us to feel deeply vulnerable, deeply tender, but also deeply present. And in that presence of the present moment, we have the opportunity to respond in new ways, and we have the clarity of thought and action to move forward with compassion, with enthusiasm even, and with inspiration. So what are those teachings? Well, the idea is this, that for most of us, when uncertain times come, if we have not been working with ourselves deeply, and those programs begin to operate that I was talking about earlier, we can actually shut down to an opportunity that uncertainty brings to all of us. First of all, you and I know, we may not remember, we may try to forget, but you and I know that actually change is constant. That uncertainty is actually just change being made visible, and that it's a constant reality for all of us. So knowing that, one of the ways that we can bring ourselves into the present moment is to remind ourselves as spiritual warriors that the path that we're walking is a path of continual change and transformation. And when uncertainty arises, either in an outer situation like the one we're having with the pandemic around the COVID-19 virus, when uncertainty arises in the outer world or when uncertainty arises in the inner world, the spiritual warrior has a set of tools that he or she uses that allow movement and proper action, right action to occur. What are those? Well, the first thing is to know that whenever there's shaky ground or uncertainty or fear, it's like a threshold or a doorway into a possible reality. Now, I know that maybe that doesn't sound like it is, but let me explain. So we're moving along in our life and we've been pretending like everybody else that everything's normal and nothing's going to change, and then something changes. And in that very moment of change or uncertainty, a doorway into a possible reality that's even greater has been presented to us. We can walk through the doorway and experience a possible reality that we haven't yet, or we can close down with those base programs and refuse to move with what's being presented and instead be dragged through the doorway by circumstance. I don't know about you, but I'm tired of being dragged around. And so when uncertainty happens, my spiritual warrior all of a sudden comes into being on alert. It's like I sometimes, in those early days when I was reading that book, I sometimes would picture myself as a samurai with a kind of a lightsaber or samurai kind of weapon of discernment and truth. And whenever uncertainty or shakiness would happen, my first move that I trained myself to do was to turn to that weapon of discernment and pull it out and hold myself steady while I looked for the threshold, while I looked for the doorway. Now, in the science of mind, what we do is we immediately turn to the indwelling presence for that discernment. We know that anything and everything that has come into our path is there for a reason. And so we turn to spirit and essentially turn ourselves into a discerning machine where we're open to what the guidance and the possibility of the present moment might hold. As we're doing that, we're knowing the truth. That's what we call it. We're knowing the truth that nothing can happen to us but by our own reactions and responses. And so we're taking personal responsibility for our reactions and our responses and moving forward with discernment across the threshold of the possible reality that, for example, this pandemic is presenting us with. What does that look like? Am I crazy? Am I a crazy woman? Well, maybe. But what it really looks like is probably what you're seeing from so many different emails and texts, and if you're on Facebook, Facebook posts, what you're seeing is that people all over the world are responding with hope, with support, with clarity. They're responding with what they know, and they're bringing it to the field of sacred humans to share it, to lift people up, to hold people in place, to remind people of their true nature. Do we see other things as well? Of course we do. Many, many sacred humans are still being dragged through the threshold of this change, and we're seeing their base responses. We're seeing people hoarding. We're seeing people responding with deep anger and deep fear and deep willfulness. We're seeing that. There's no question about it. But that doesn't mean we have to do it that way. Instead, we can turn to the tool of discernment and look deeply at the situation, looking for the possibilities that are being offered, and responding with the mind perceptual frame of seeing that this change is part of a larger unfolding, personally as well as collectively. It's powerful stuff when we begin to see the world in this way. What do we do next? Well, this is the hard part for me. In those early days when I was learning to be a spiritual warrior, I was also in a new relationship with someone who had just gotten out of the Marine Corps. And so, as you might know, the Marines have kind of an image of themselves as first responders to anything that's difficult, and they go in there with power and force and, save the world, basically. And so I was with this man whose response to fear was to go forward anyway. And so I kept finding myself being placed in situations that I was deeply afraid of. I'll tell you one of them. I was thinking about it this morning. Haven't thought about it for years. We were in relationship and we needed a car. So we got a little VW Bug. But I had been in the privileged position in my family of origin of never learning how to drive a stick car, a stick shift. And so this little VW Bug, of course, was a little stick shift kind of car. So my Marine friend was going to teach me how to drive a stick shift. So the way he did that is he took me on top of a mountain and parked the Bug in a pullout facing off the mountain, and told me that I needed to learn how to put it in reverse. I was terrified. And I froze. That's one of our responses when we're terrified, is we freeze. But eventually, I just kept working with the stick shift, finding reverse. You better believe there were a lot of slamming on the brakes as I was figuring that out. But I did find how to reverse. I was deeply relieved and exhausted at the same time. So his approach was, okay, meet the fear head on, be with it head on, and just do it anyway. And so for many, many years, because I was in relationship with him, that's how I related to anything that I was afraid of. I would meet it head on. At one point, I had a fear of heights. I still have it a little bit. But at that point, it was very difficult for me to be in high places. And so to meet the fear head on, I decided that I would learn how to skydive. So I went down to the skydiving place, and They showed me the basics, and then they got me in a little tiny plane with no door, and we went way high up. And my instructor was from Australia, and he started singing a Beatles song, "Let me take you down, 'cause we're going to," and as he's singing to me, he's strapping me onto him. That's how you learn how to skydive, is you do a tandem dive. So he said, "Well, are you ready?" And I said, "About as ready as I'll ever be." And we leaped out of that plane. And I realized at that moment that I had a choice, that I could scream all the way down, or cry all the way down, or do other mechanisms like that. Or, believing that I was probably going to die, I could smile all the way down, because I was being filmed. And so I smiled all the way down. When I landed and got out of the harness and kind of got my bearing again, someone said, "Well, what do you think?" And I smiled again and I said, "This is not my sport." And it wasn't. But what that experience taught me, the experience of the VW bug on the mountain, is yes, you can deal with fear head on. You can meet it with bravery. You can meet it with willpower. You can do that. And it's valuable to do that. But actually what's more important to me is the response when we meet uncertainty, not how we do it, but rather the response. Meaning, I was in midair, and I realized with the sword of discernment, I could scream and cry and do my fear dance all the way down to the earth, or I could smile and be present with the fact that this was going to be my one and only skydive, and I was going to smile for posterity into that camera, so that my response was what I wanted it to be, not what my programming told me it should be. Now, let me talk about another type of programming that we do, and this is from Pema Chodron. Pema tells a story about when we are uncertain, there are two different maneuvers that we often do, and she tells stories about both of them on herself. The first is we get very, very busy. We get very busy. Let me see what she says. So we speed up, she says. And the way she did notice that she was doing this is she was out in the middle of nowhere in a small retreat cabin, 2-room cabin. And she became aware that what was happening was she was very anxious and uncertain about what she was doing with this retreat for herself. And she realized that she was speeded up. And she was going back and forth between the 2 rooms, starting something but not finishing it, and then going over here and starting something else and not finishing it, and then going back and doing something else there and going back. She said it was like watching myself be a ping pong ball, back and forth and back and forth. And I was just incredibly speeded up as a response to the uncertainty that I was feeling. I've watched a lot of people do that during this pandemic, where they get super, super busy. They may not be able to leave their home, but all of a sudden they have a yoga practice and a meditation practice, and they're reading 5 books, and they're doing several craft projects, and they're. I don't know if that's your style, because there's another style. She calls it the overly lazy style. The overly lazy style is you become completely paralyzed, and you begin to be a couch potato, and you watch endless episodes of The Throne, or you are constantly on your phone watching. Come on, people, play my game. Come on, people, say something else on Facebook. Come on. And you're not moving at all, but you're distracting yourself with outer things to help with the paralysis. I don't know if you relate to either of those. I can do both. I can be speeded up for half the day and couch potato the next. But what Pema's instruction is, instead of doing those things, we can become a spiritual warrior to ourselves and begin to realize that these responses are coming out of a deep-seated fear of encountering our own true nature. And so rather than do those responses, she suggests that we simply pay attention to what's really going on. That we bring ourselves to the present trembling moment. And instead of doing any of the things to distract ourselves from the present moment, we actually invite ourselves to be with it completely and fully. Now, what happens when we do that, and this is what I've experienced over and over, when we are willing to be present with whatever is for ourselves, we have the opportunity to choose, to discern a path forward that doesn't invoke these behaviors that take us away from ourselves, but instead invite us to be very, very open-heartedly present with who we are and who we want to be. When we do that, something really interesting happens. It's not that fear goes away. It doesn't. It's not that anger goes away. It doesn't necessarily. It's not that willpower necessarily just vanishes from your horizon. But in the present moment, in that sweet, tender place where you're noticing the shakiness of the situation, there's an opportunity to simply be with that shakiness without any of those programs running. And naturally, what begins to arise, and you can try this for yourself today, naturally what begins to arise is gratitude. Naturally what arises is compassion for ourselves and for everyone else feeling this same shakiness. Naturally what arises is a vulnerability and a tender heart. You may even have found yourself weeping occasionally for no apparent reason. Maybe one of your friends posted on Facebook a bunch of St. Bernards with toilet paper around their necks, and you laugh, but then you find yourself weeping. That's all because you're in touch with that tender heart. You're in touch with the present moment and the shakiness of the situation that we're in. And that's good. That's where the threshold lies. That's where the doorway is. That's where the possible reality is available. And rather than shut down, if we open, we begin to feel this expanded sense of connection to ourselves first, and then to everyone else. And that's where all those incredible messages of support are coming from. It's people, spiritual teachers, regular people, who, doctors, nurses, sanitation workers. I even saw an incredibly open-hearted post from a garbage man. Those messages are coming from their tender heart, from the threshold that they saw and walked through, and realized that by not fleeing, by standing with the shakiness, they had the opportunity to offer who they were to themselves and other people. And you know what, folks? That's what we need to be doing right now. We need to offer the best of who we are out into the world. I don't know what lies ahead. That's what uncertainty means. But what I do know is that I have control over my response. My ability to respond allows me to see the threshold, the opportunity within this uncertainty, to be with the shakiness and the vulnerability, and not to be fazed, but rather to treat it as part of my sacred path as a spiritual warrior. So I'm going to do a prayer for that, and then I'm going to give you a few announcements. I don't usually do this on the podcast, but because you're joining me live, I want you to know a couple of things. So please join me in this prayer. I'll say it for myself, but it's also for you if you would like to take it. Oh my, I know the way I can get when uncertainty and the understanding of change is present. And here and now, I remember that there is a vast intelligence and love within all things and within me. I do not need to be shoved around by old programs that would take me on a dark ride, a ride of fear or pride, will or anger. Instead, in this moment, I invoke that intelligence and love, and I accept a new way. unfolding in me, through me, as me, and before me. This new way is the way of discernment and love. I am willing to be fully present each day to the miracle of being a sacred human on the earth, to the miracles presented in this time of pandemic. I am willing to use all that I have gathered in spiritually as tools for the spiritual walk that we are all on now. As I open in willingness to using these tools and staying very present, compassion, gratitude, tenderness, love arise easily and readily through me, in me. And I am sustained by those, I am enriched by those feelings and knowings, and I'm able to give them out into the world as a healing balm, as a presence of truth. In this way, I am supported and I am in a position to be of support to others. And I'm grateful for this time, the reminder that we are all in this together, that we do have what we have to offer to the whole. And I'm grateful for my own willingness to offer it. And so it is.
So it is.
All right, so here are the announcements. First and foremost, as you might expect, our donations are down considerably. And there's a donate button on the CSL Bellingham website. And we would deeply appreciate if you get value from these Facebook Live events, if you get value from the Center for Spiritual Living in Bellingham. We would deeply appreciate your donations at this time. We know that some of you have already experienced unemployment or being furloughed, so we understand if you can't do that. But if you can, we really appreciate it a lot. Thank you very much for that. Now, there's a couple of things you may want to be involved with out there in the ethers. One is a class that I began to teach today, and if you missed it, that's not a problem. It's a class that's using the book by Joe Dispenza called You Are the Placebo. And it's a class working with the power of our mind to heal and to reveal truth. And if you would like to be part of that class, you need to shoot me an email so I can send you the link to the next Zoom class, which is next Sunday at 9 a.m. It's an hour-long class. You can find my email address on the CSL Bellingham website, and I'd love you to join the class. There's about 60 of us right now. In addition, we have another wonderful Zoom class that's beginning this week, and it's being taught by one of our ministerial students, and it's called From Whence We Came, and it's a study of the founders of the New Thought movement, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Emma Curtis Hopkins, Mary Baker Eddy, all kinds of teachers who founded the ideas that are now evolving in quantum physics and all of the other disciplines that are discovering that what we knew centuries ago is actually true, really true. So if you'd like to take that class, you can contact our CSL office at 360-734-4160 and let us know you want to be registered for the class, and we'll make sure that that happens. Let's see what else we have. We have postponed our Gourmets for Good event, but we would love you to consider being a host for that event. And there is a host form to fill out if you would like to provide a meal and connection to people in our community that's available on the CSL website. You go to that form, you tell us what you'd like to make, and give us some dates in the summer. We think we'll be able to do this in the summer, and we really appreciate that. Mostly because for us, we know how much connection our community has with one another, and we're sorely missing that one-on-one contact. So being a host will allow us to get together, to gather around a dinner table or a picnic lunch or whatever, and see one another in person. Our community is offering connection calls, and you should be receiving one of those shortly if you're a member of our community, a friend or a member. But if you're not, you're part of a larger community and you would like some outreach from us, please let us know by calling the office, and we'll add you to our list and give you either an email or a text or a phone call, depending on what you tell us you'd like. Don't forget that our prayer partners, our practitioners, are here for you during this time and are available for spiritual mind treatment. You can email them, and you can find the email on our website. And then this little thing is available on our website as well. We do a program called Laundry Love, and what we do is we provide laundry services for those who are experiencing homelessness. And during this time, of course, our donations to that program are low, and we have the opportunity to win a cash prize from Bob Wallen Insurance. But everyone has to vote for us to qualify for one of those prizes. The first prize is $2,000, which would take us a long way into the future for those who need our laundry services. So if you wouldn't mind looking this up on the website and voting, we would really appreciate it, because those cash prizes will float our program for a little while longer. I want you to know that right after this broadcast is done, my music director, Amber Darlin, is going to come on from her couch and do a live mini concert to offer you some inspiring music to support you in your spiritual journey and just in your life. So be watching for Amber Darlin live and tune into her music. And thank you very much for joining us today. We'll see you next week.